Firstly, let me say what a pleasure it is to be here at the world's foremost tech company to talk about mathematics. I'm actually not really going to be talking very much mathematics today. I'm going to be telling you a little bit about the book. It's called The Maths of Life and Death, but despite having maths in the title, there really isn't much maths in there. There's no equations in the whole of the book, actually. And it's not really a book for mathematicians. It's a book for people who are interested in the places where maths might have an impact on their everyday life, perhaps without them even knowing it. So there's lots of stories, basically, in the book about people who've been impacted by mathematics. So it might be people who've been maligned by mathematical miscarriages of justice, or it might be people who've received a dodgy medical test result because the doctor who was interpreting the statistics behind the result didn't really have a good grasp of the mathematics. Or it might be people who have read a newspaper headline and made a significant lifestyle choice based on that newspaper headline, but it turns out that the headline wasn't really the whole truth. It was just part of the truth. It was a statistic that had been spun in one way or another. So that's what I'm going to do today, is just tell you some of the stories and hope that you enjoy them for stories as much as for the maths that's hidden behind them. There's going to be three parts to the talk. So I'm going to start by talking about places where maths can appear in a medical context, and then I'll look at maths in the media and the newspapers, and then we'll finish by talking about maths in the criminal justice system. It's the maths of crime. So we'll start with maths and medicine. I'm going to talk about screening first. So if you don't know, if you're not aware, screening programs are programs where we invite people who are at a slightly increased risk of getting a particular disease. It might be breast cancer or prostate cancer, for example. We invite them to come for a test, and then we tell them if they are positive for that particular disease, we tell them to come for further tests. So it's a way of trying to catch things like cancer as early as possible so that we can treat them as early as possible and get better outcomes for those diseases. So I'm going to give you some statistics on breast cancer screening in the United Kingdom. And then I'm going to ask you a question, maybe do a bit of audience participation stuff, and it's a question that was asked to 160 doctors, and we're going to see whether you guys can do any better or worse than the doctors did. And not to spoil it, it's quite a low bar, so we'll see how we get on. Okay, so these are the statistics. The probability that a woman who's over 50 has undiagnosed breast cancer is 0.4%. This is called the prevalence. So the reason I'm saying women over 50 is because in the United Kingdom, it's women over 50 who are routinely invited for breast cancer screens every 3 years. So the prevalence of 0.4% means that of 1,000 women who go for these screens, on average 4 of them will have undiagnosed breast cancer. Okay, so when you go for this screen, if you have breast cancer, if a woman has breast cancer, then she'll be correctly told that 9 times out of 10. So 90% of the time she will test positive. 10% of the time she'll be given an incorrect result, which is a false negative. So she'll be told she doesn't have cancer when in fact she does. Alternatively, if you're a woman who goes for a screen and doesn't have breast cancer, then the probability that you're incorrectly told you do, which is called a false positive, is 10%. So 9 times out of 10, again, the result will be correct. You'll be correctly told you don't have breast cancer, but 1 time out of 10, you'll be given an incorrect false positive diagnosis. And so the question that was asked to these 160 doctors is, which of the following best characterises the probability that a patient who has a positive mammogram, who gets a letter saying you need to come for further tests, actually has breast cancer? So I'm going to give you 5 possibilities, 5 probabilities in the form of percentages, and then if you feel comfortable, then I'll ask you to put your hand up for each one of these, and we'll see how we're doing. Again, it's a complicated mathematical problem. I'm not asking you to work out the maths in your head, but I'm asking you to perhaps use your intuition. So which of the following numbers best characterises the probability a patient who gets a positive mammogram actually has the disease? A, 90%, B, 81%, C, 49.1%, D, 3.5%, or E, 0.4%. So if you feel comfortable, if you don't, then you don't need to put your hand up, that's not a problem. If you feel comfortable, I'll just go through the options and you can put your hand up for each one that we go through. So who fancies that the probability that if you get a letter, you are told that you have the disease, who fancies that the probability that you actually have the disease is 90%, option A? Anyone fancy that? No, no one's feeling positive about one person. Sorry, high hands. Yeah, good, very good. Don't be scared. Don't be scared. I'm not going to isolate people. It's just to get a broad picture of what people are thinking. What about B? 81%. Who fancies 81%? Few people, yeah. Be brave, be brave, be brave. Big hands, yeah. Okay, so 7 or 8, 9 people maybe out of an audience of maybe 40 or 50. Okay, what about C? 49.1%. So a little bit more positive still. Yeah, okay, so maybe only 4 or 5 for that. What D? 3.5%. Okay, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 or 8 people again. And then E, 0.4%. Oops, give away the answer there. No one fancies E, what a surprise. Well, in fact, yes, the answer is D, 3.5%, which I think is a little bit surprising. Certainly when I first saw this, I did not get the answer to this question right. You guys actually did pretty well on that. The doctors, when they were asked this question, fewer than 20% of them got the answer right, which means that they would have done better on average if they'd just been guessing purely at random, which doesn't give you great confidence in the people who are interpreting our medical test results, perhaps. So 3.5%, where does this come from? How can it be that of all the letters that get sent out, only 3.5% of them actually correspond to true positives? Well, you can work this out using Bayesian probability if you want to, but actually there's a simpler way of doing it, and this is part of the point of the book, is to make things simple. So we're going to consider 10,000 women who go for these screens. So of these 10,000 women, 0.4% of them, we've said, will actually have the disease. So that's 40 women will actually have breast cancer. And the remainder, the 99.6% of these 10,000 women, so that's 9,960 women, the vast majority of women will not have the disease when they go for the test. Okay, so of the women that test positive for the disease, 90% of them will, of the women that actually have the disease, 90% of them will test positive, so that's 36 women, and 4% of them, unfortunately, will be given a false negative diagnosis. Now, of the vast majority of the women that don't have the disease, again, 90% of them will be correctly told they don't have the disease, so that's nearly 9,000 women, 8,964. But 10% of this large proportion of women who don't have the disease, so 996, will be given an incorrect false positive result. So when you look at the total number of positives, it's these 36 true positives and these 996 false positives. The false positives clearly massively outweigh the number of true positives. And the reason for that is because you're testing such a large proportion of people who don't actually have the disease. And if your test lacks even a little bit of what's called specificity, i.e. it has a non-trivial rate of false positives, 10% in this case, then you end up having the false positives massively outweighing the true positives. So when you work out that proportion of correct positives, it's just 36 out of 1,032, which is 0.035 or 3.5%, that answer D that I flashed up a little bit early. Okay, so this was a bit of a surprise to me. Well, what's the problem with this? Well, there's a story in the book about a lady called Kaz Daniels. She's a mother of 3 from Northampton, and she goes for a breast cancer screen. And she gets a letter back on a Thursday afternoon, and it says, you need to come for further tests on Monday, so 3 days' time. And she thinks, well, this is pretty urgent. 3 days' time, why are they telling me to come so quickly? They obviously need to treat me quite quickly. Something's happened. I've clearly got cancer. And she stresses for the whole weekend. She doesn't eat properly. She doesn't sleep properly. She wonders about what's going to happen to her 3 kids after she dies from cancer. And of course, when she goes on the Monday for these further tests, it turns out that she doesn't have the disease after all. In fact, it was a false positive, as was always most likely to be the case. So false positives can have psychological problems and can cause anxiety in people, but they can also lead to people undergoing further invasive tests which are unnecessary. So some people who'll be given a false positive will undergo a biopsy to try and understand whether their lump is tumour or not. And that's clearly an invasive and unpleasant procedure. But false positives aren't the only problem with our screening programme. So this is a quote from Muir Gray, who's the former director of the UK National Screening Programme. He says, all screening programmes do harm. Some do good as well, and of these, some do more good than harm at a reasonable cost. And this is a quote from Fiona Godley, who's the editor-in-chief of the British Medical Journal, quoting a study in her own journal. She said, the harms of screening are certain, but the benefits and overall mortality are not. And so why are they saying this about these screening programs? Well, it turns out that screening programs are pretty good at catching early stage cancer. In fact, they can be so good that they can catch tumours which would never cause a problem in a woman's lifetime because they're so small or slow growing. So they would never actually cause a problem. But nevertheless, when people hear the word cancer or they hear the word tumour, then an alarm bell goes off in their head and they think, I need to take radical action in order to avert this potential crisis, even though, as I've mentioned, in some cases, these tumours would never cause a problem. So people undergo unnecessary treatment like having mastectomy. So Angelina Jolie had a preemptive double mastectomy, for example, or people undergo radiotherapy. And these treatments have their own risks associated with them. So undergoing mastectomy requires that you undergo general anaesthetic, and it's an unpleasant operation, and it obviously has other psychological issues associated with it. Radiotherapy carries an increased risk of heart disease, for example. So these excess treatments are not without their own risks. And actually it's estimated that for every one life that's saved by breast cancer screening, 3 women are over-treated, are treated unnecessarily for tumours which would never cause a problem in their lifetime. So screening programmes are a mixed bag. But what I'm not saying is don't go for screening, and I'll re-emphasise that again later. But I think we need to be careful to take screening results with a pinch of salt. The other message from screening programs is that we should start to expect false positives. So women who are invited for screening in the UK are invited from the age of about 50 to the age of 72, 73. So they might expect to undergo a number of screens during their lifetime. And so the question that I want to ask is, if these screening results are all independent of each other, they have this independent false positive rate of 10%, how many screens do you have to go for before it becomes more likely than not that you will have received a false positive? So we can work this out by doing a little bit of mathematics. So I'm going to work through, for a number of different tests that you go to, firstly I'm going to try and find the probability of not having received a false positive after that many tests, because that's going to be quite easy to work out. And then I'm going to try and work out the probability of having received a false positive, which is just 1 minus the figure that will appear here, because those are the only 2 options. Either you've received no false positives, or you've received at least 1 false positive over the course of the screens that you've been to. So after 1 test, we know the probability of no false positive is 90%, 0.9. The probability of 1 false positive is therefore 10%, or 0.1. That's just the figure that we were given for a single test. So we know that already. After you go for 2 tests, the probability of not having received a false positive, well, you need to have received no false positive in the first test with probability 0.9 and no false positive in the second test with probability 0.9. So you multiply those 2 together if they're independent of each other, and you get 0.81. Okay, so the probability of having received at least 1 false positive is 1 minus 0.81, which is 0.19. Okay, after 3 tests, again, you need to have had no false positive in the first, none in the second, none in the third. So that means that you have to multiply 0.9 by itself 3 times this time, and so you get 0.729, and then the probability of having at least 1 false positive is 1 minus that at 0.271. I could keep going, but it would get boring. Let's skip to the answer though. By the time you get to 7 tests, 7 mammograms, the probability of not having received a false positive on any of those 7 tests is 0.9 to the 7, which is just below a half. So the probability of receiving a false positive, at least 1 false positive over the course of those 7 tests, is 1 minus that. It's just above a half at 0.522. So with women undergoing screening for a period of 20, 22, 23 years, every 3 years, you might expect to go to 7 or 8 screenings over the course of your lifetime. And therefore the probability of, if these tests are independent of each other, the probability of having received a false positive is, it effectively becomes more likely than not. So we should start to expect these false positives. We should start to expect to receive them in the letter, and okay, again, not to say don't go for screening, but we should start to think to take screening results with a pinch of salt and not to get too worried until we actually go for the follow-up tests which confirm things one way or another. So the take-home messages from this part of the talk are, yeah, don't take screening results overly seriously, or at least take them with a pinch of salt. The analogy I like to make is with a job interview. So if you're going for a job interview, if you're a company trying to search for someone, for example, then you'll put out an advert and you invite people to send in their CVs. This is sort of a broad brush measure where you can vaguely assess the quality of different candidates and choose the candidates you want to invite for interview. And when you invite them for interview, then you can throw a much more intensive test at them. You can actually interview them, or you can send assessment centres, or you can ask them your Google killer questions, whatever it is you want to do. But you can't do that for everyone, which is why you ask people to send in their CVs, which is a sort of broad, cheap measure of how to assess that person. In the same way, a screen is a really broad brush test. It's not as accurate. It's not the most accurate test that we can throw at people, but we can't afford to throw the most accurate test at everyone, especially when the vast majority of people don't have this disease. So the first stage of the screen is to try and find people who are at increased risk of the disease, and then we call them in for further diagnostic testing where we can be much more accurate and we can apply tests we can't apply to everyone. And the point is that if you get invited for an interview for a job, you don't assume that you've got the job, right? And in exactly the same way, when you get called back for further testing for a screen, you shouldn't assume that you've got the disease which is being screened for, okay? So that's the analogy I like to draw. We should start to expect these false positives. So if you go for enough of these screens and the false positive rate is sufficiently high, so even as high as 10%, by the time you've gone to 7 screens, it becomes more likely than not for you to have received a false positive. And the last piece is ask for a second opinion. So this sort of goes two ways. The example at the start tends to illustrate that the people who are interpreting the statistics required to understand what these medical test results mean don't necessarily have the best grip on the statistics. You may need to ask for a second opinion, or at least ask them to explain to you how the statistics work and see if they genuinely do understand it. And also, 2 tests can be better than 1. So a sort of surprising figure is that you can run a second test, and even if it's no more accurate than the first test, you can dramatically reduce the rate of false positives. So this is why when athletes give a urine sample, it's split into an A and a B sample. So if the first sample comes back positive, they run the test on the second sample, and if that then comes back negative, then that athlete is exonerated, because running a second test, even if it's no more accurate than the first, can dramatically reduce the rate of false positives. So 2 tests can be better than 1. It's worth remembering. Okay, so I'm going to segue into the second part of the talk, looking at maths in the media. I'm going to stick on a sort of medical theme though. So it seems that every day almost, at least every week, there's a headline in the newspaper which is all about how our lifestyle choices are impacting on our health. And people like to read this. People genuinely like to understand how to improve their health, and they want to know what things they could be doing differently in order to improve their health. But it seems like, you know, all the time we're eating too much of the wrong stuff, or we're drinking too much, or maybe we're not drinking enough, or we're sleeping too much or too long or too little. There are all these headlines about our lifestyle choices impacting our chances of getting diseases. And they usually come accompanied with a statistic which they use to back up their claims. And so I found a statistic in a newspaper, and it shocked me, and I want to tell you about that story. So in 2009, the World Cancer Research Fund published a report which was an amalgam of hundreds of different studies onto the impact of our lifestyle choices, the impact our lifestyle choices were having on our chances of getting various different types of cancer. So it was over 100 different studies, and they'd summarised the results in a 500-page report. And the Sun newspaper read this report, or someone at the Sun read this report, or at least they read some of it, and they decided to pick just one of these hundreds of reports to highlight. And they looked at a report which was investigating the risk of getting colorectal cancer for people who eat 50 grams of processed meat a day. So this was the original study. And the Sun chose to convey the results of this study using the admittedly inspired headline, "Careless Pork Costs Lives." So in this article that I read, they claimed for people that eat a bacon sandwich every day, the increase in risk of getting colorectal cancer was as high as 20%. And this alarmed me because I didn't really understand what it meant. I thought, could it possibly be true that if people who don't eat a bacon sandwich every day, maybe their background rate of getting colorectal cancer is 5%, does it mean then that of people who eat a bacon sandwich every day, that their risk of getting colorectal cancer is as high as 25%? And this sort of alarmed me, that a quarter of all people who eat bacon sandwiches could be getting colorectal cancer. And I guess this was the idea that it was this, you know, the idea that they were trying to portray was that this was a big figure and it was shocking and surprising. And so before I could investigate this, the Sun then launched a Save Our Bacon campaign, in which they branded scientists as health Nazis who declared a war on bacon, despite the fact that, as I mentioned, the original article was nothing to do with bacon. It was all about processed meat, of which bacon is one type. But this is the way that Sun decided to play this, and they sold loads and loads of newspapers on the back of this Save Our Bacon campaign, because they knew that pitching it in terms of bacon would strike at the heart of the British psyche. People really like their bacon sandwiches. So I wanted to investigate this and figure out where this statistic came from. So it turned out that what the Sun had calculated is a figure called a relative risk. So they'd looked at this study, and they'd found that of people that don't eat a bacon sandwich, 5 people might expect to get colorectal cancer over the course of their lifetime. And then they'd compared this to people who do eat bacon sandwiches, and they'd found that 6 people might expect to get colorectal cancer over the course of their lifetime. And then they'd calculated this thing called the relative risk. So this is usually used for the increased risk of or the increased or decreased risk of a treatment or a side effect of a treatment. So in this case, the treatment is eating a bacon sandwich. So they calculated the risk of getting colorectal cancer with eating a bacon sandwich every day, and they divided that by the risk without eating a bacon sandwich every day. So they'd found 6, and they divided that by 5, and they'd appreciated that 6 is actually an increase of 20% on 5. It's completely true. It's this figure 1.2, and 1.2 is an increase of 20% on 1, the baseline risk. So in fact, their figure was not incorrect. They hadn't made a mistake in the mathematics, but they'd just been slightly disingenuous in the way that they'd presented this. Okay, so they'd found a 20% increase in relative risk. But if you see a newspaper article and it just has a single figure, and it's usually a big figure and it's a percentage, then you should be really careful about how much you believe that article. Because what we really need to know to interpret how dangerous it is to eat a bacon sandwich is not the relative risk. We need to know something called the absolute risk. Okay, so the absolute risk says that of 100 people that eat a bacon sandwich, on average, 5 of them, who don't eat a bacon sandwich, on average, 5 of them will get colorectal cancer over the course of their lifetime. And then when you compare that to people who do eat a bacon sandwich, it increases massively to 6 people out of 100. So it's really not a huge risk increase. It's a 1% absolute risk increase. But because the background rate of 5% is so low, even a small increase of just 1 person per 100 can make the relative risk seem really large. So if you see just a single figure, usually a percentage, then you should start to question whether you believe that article. At least you should dig deeper, perhaps, to find out what the true statistics are. So this is a concept called mismatch framing, and I'd like to pretend that it only occurs in newspapers in order to sell newspapers, but actually it occurs all over the place. It occurs in scientific journals, and also occurs in patient advice literature. So this is a screenshot from, you can probably date it yourselves, it's from the early 2000s, of a tool called the Breast Cancer Risk Assessment Tool, which was a patient advice literature tool from the National Cancer Institute in the United States. And they effectively reported a load of different scientific results and tried to make them easy to understand for the general public, people who might be suffering from breast cancer and wanted to make informed decisions about what treatments they took. So in particular, they reported one study on a drug called tamoxifen, which is quite a famous drug for breast cancer treatment. And they presented the results of this drug tamoxifen and how it could reduce cases of breast cancer. So they said women taking tamoxifen had 49% fewer diagnoses of breast cancer than people in their study who were taking a placebo, so a sugar pill. They had these 2 comparison arms of the trial. And then when they presented potential side effects of this drug, so one of the side effects is actually a slight increase in uterine cancer, they presented them like this. So they said the annual rate of uterine cancer was 23 per 10,000 women taking tamoxifen compared to 9.1 per 10,000 in the placebo arm. So quite a long sentence, and these small figures, 23 per 10,000 and 9.1 per 10,000. So they presented these as absolute risks, whereas they presented the decrease in the risk of the disease as a relative risk, and they presented it as a percentage to make it look big rather than saying 0.49. They presented it as a percentage, and they presented the other numbers as 23 out of 10,000. Seems pretty small, right? So maybe the increase in rates of uterine cancer is effectively negligible. This is what we're sort of led to believe by looking at these different ways of framing these 2 statistics. But actually what we need to do is use a fair playing field in order to understand what these risks are. So a fair comparison would be to give maybe both as relative risks or both as absolute risks. So if you give the absolute risks, then we've already seen this for uterine cancer. Tamoxifen, when you're taking tamoxifen, there are just 23 cases per 10,000. And when people are not taking tamoxifen, then there are even fewer. There's 9.1 per 10,000. So there's an increase of about 14 cases per 10,000 of uterine cancer for people taking this drug. When you compare that to breast cancer, then you can see that actually tamoxifen reduces the rate of breast cancer from 68 per 10,000 down to 34 per 10,000. So roughly halves, as we saw, the number of cases when people are taking tamoxifen. So this would be a fair way of presenting the results. But this wasn't the way that the benefits of tamoxifen were presented. They were presented using the relative risk. So it said 49% fewer fewer cases of breast cancer using tamoxifen, which seems amazing. But the reason they didn't present the increase in cases of uterine cancer using the relative risk is because it looks really bad. Because actually 13.9 cases as an increase on the base rate of 9.1% is 153% more diagnoses. So it looks really bad. But the point is that you need to be presenting these statistics one way or the other, but preferably using absolute risks. But if you present them using different frames, then people really can't get a grip of they can't make an informed choice about the side effects versus the benefits. And the irony is that if they just presented these absolute risks, you would see that the net decrease in cancer rates is, well, that you save 34 cancer cases in breast cancer when taking tamoxifen, and you only increase the number by 14, so you get a net saving of about 20 cases per 10,000. So the drug really does have benefits, but by trying to make it look too good, they'd misled people into thinking, or into the wrong conclusions about this drug. Okay, so there are lots of ways to manipulate statistics, and there are loads more in the book, and newspapers are very savvy with many of these. But if all else fails, then you could do what Donald Trump did back in 2015, which is just make it up. So I should warn you, this is a little bit more of a serious part of the talk before we go there, but this is an infographic that was retweeted by Donald Trump in November 2015 in the run-up to trying to be nominated as a Republican candidate for the presidential election. And so the statistics I want to highlight to you for comparison later are the proportion of black people killed by police. So of all black people that are killed, the percentage killed by police is allegedly as low as 1%, and for white people it's allegedly as high as 3%. And then these are the other two statistics I want you to focus on. The proportion of white people killed by other white people is apparently as low as 16%, and the proportion of all white people who are killed by black people is apparently as high as 81%. So these statistics come directly from the Crime Statistics Bureau in San Francisco. And there's a sort of spoiler alert for the rest of this part of the talk. The Crime Statistics Bureau in San Francisco doesn't exist. It's completely made up. So you can see where we're going to go with this. So I did a little fact check on these statistics, right? And so for comparison, the proportion of black people who are killed by police is not 1%, it's actually 11%. And similarly, white people killed by police is not 3%, but actually as high as 16%. So police killings were massively underplayed with this statistic. And then of the proportion of white people killed by other white people, it's not 16%, but 81%. And the proportion of white people killed by black people is not 81%, but 16%. So they'd actually gone to the trouble of finding out the real statistics, but then they just swapped these two figures over to paint a really different picture. So it's really naughty, and it's not a great thing to do. It's interesting that, so these statistics come from the FBI website, but actually these are for 2015. At the time that I was looking these up, the FBI didn't keep statistics for the number of people killed by police officers. And so these two statistics actually come from the Guardian website, the UK newspaper. And it's a little bit alarming, and even James Comey, who's the director who was the director of the FBI at the time, said it's embarrassing that this British newspaper has better statistics on what our police are doing than we do. And so now the FBI do keep better statistics. But actually the Guardian had this project called the Counted Project, and they actually recorded the number of fatalities in police incidents and the ethnicities of people who were killed in those fatalities. So yeah, it was embarrassing that the FBI were not keeping statistics on this. Okay, so that was a simple fact check. This isn't really very mathematical so far. But then this was important because it was sort of at the time when the Black Lives Matter movement in the US was at its zenith. And so these statistics were really important and debated. And then a year later, in September 2016, the Black Lives Matter movement had sort of made its way over to the United Kingdom. And Rod Liddell, who was a journalist in The Sun, wrote this about the Black Lives Matter movement. He said, "There's no doubt whatsoever that the greatest danger to black people in the United States is other black people." And to back this up, he said, "Black on black murders average more than 4,000 each year. But the number of black men killed by US cops, rightly or wrongly," he says, "is little more than 100 each year." And then he says, "Go on, do the math." So obviously I read this and thought, right, I'll do the math. I'll do the maths. So I went and looked at these statistics, and I'll present them to you. So Liddell said that black on black murders average more than 4,000 each year. So if you look at the total number of killings in the United States for 2015, which is the last year that Liddell could conceivably have got statistics if he'd wanted to, you find that the total number of black people in the United States that were killed was actually only 2,664, so way below the 4,000 that Little was claiming. Of those, 2,380 were committed by black people and 229 by white people. Okay, so nowhere near the 4,000 that Little was claiming. Little also said that the number of black men killed by US cops, rightly or wrongly, is little more than 100 each year. So if you go to the Guardian website and you actually find out the real statistics, you find that the number of black people killed by police is actually 307, so 3 times higher than Little had claimed. These are the corresponding statistics for white people in the United States, so a total of 3,167 killings in which the victim, the person who died, was white. And I guess the statistic that's important to highlight here is that this ratio of the number of people killed by race, 45% of the people killed in the United States are black, and about 55% are white, which is alarming given that black people only account for about 12% of the population in the United States. So black people are being killed at a disproportionately high rate, which is something that Little sort of hid away when he wrote this article. So the last thing he said is, there's no doubt whatsoever that the greatest danger to black people in the United States is other black people, based on these statistics that he dug out. And it sort of it shows here that actually there are more killings of black people by other black people in the United States. So is his little statement true then? Just because there are more killings of black people than there are by law enforcement officers, does it mean that the greatest danger to black people is other black people? Well, I want to do a thought experiment with you to try and figure this out. So in 2015, toddlers shot and killed 21 US citizens. It's alarming, I know. In the same year, bears killed just 2 US citizens. And so the question I'll ask you as a thought experiment is, who would you rather be left alone in a room with, a toddler or a bear? Right? The answer for almost everyone, I think, would be a toddler. Toddlers kill more people in the United States than bears do, not because toddlers are inherently more dangerous than bears or more murderous. It's because there are a shed load more toddlers in the United States than there are bears, and they come into contact with people more often than bears do, and for some reason they manage to get hold of guns. But that's America for you. But in exactly the same way, more black people in the United States are killed by other black people, not because black people are more dangerous than law enforcement officers, because there are just lots more black people in the United States than there are law enforcement officers. So actually, what we really need to understand is, if you're a black person in the United States and you're walking down the street and you see someone approaching you in a dark alley, should you be more worried whether it's another black person or a police officer? Then we need to find out something which isn't just the absolute rates of killing. We need to know what's called the per capita rate of killing. So the rate at which each of those populations, black people or police officers, kills other black people. So we've already seen these statistics. So the number of killings in which the victim was black, perpetrated by black citizens, was 2,380, and law enforcement officers was 307. When you work out this per capita rate, when you take account of the size of the relative populations, you see that black people in the United States account for about 40 million people, whereas law enforcement officers, there's fewer than 700,000. So when you divide this figure by this figure to get the per capita rate, you see the per capita rate at which black people kill other black people is lower than 1 in 17,000, whereas the rate for police officers is much higher at 1 in 2,000. Okay, so it hints that Little's claim that black people should be more scared of other black people is completely disingenuous, because he's really not taken account of the size of these two populations, which is something that you need to do in order to properly understand the statistics. Okay, so the take-home messages from this part of the talk are: look out for these relative risks. If you just see a single big headline figure in a newspaper article, take it with a massive, massive dose of salt. Go and look up the real statistics. Fortunately, more and more often you can go and look up the actual scientific journal online and find out the headline statistics. They often have a summary for lay people, so you can go and read that and actually find out what the true statistics are. So be wary. Unless you see these two smaller figures, the absolute risks, then be wary of that. Similarly, watch out for this mismatched framing. If you see people presenting the benefits of their product using a big percentage figure to make it look good, and then the side effects using some small absolute risks, then you need to be careful, and you need to go and work out what the relative risk is for the side effects, as well as you need to put them in the same frame, basically. And then the last point is, it's not really a mathematical point, but clearly most of the things that our politicians are saying we need to be a little bit wary of. And we're getting better at fact-checking people, but it still isn't stopping politicians from playing loose with the truth. Okay, so the last part of the talk that I want to get onto is just talking briefly about crime in the criminal justice system. And so I want to do a little mathematical problem. Some of you might have seen it before, some of you might not have done. It's called the birthday problem. And so I want to ask what the probability that two people in this room share a birthday is. So there's roughly 40 people in the room, maybe a few fewer. So I've got a shiny British pound, and I'm willing to bet this pound with someone. I'm going to bet that there are two people in this room that share a birthday. Is anyone willing to take me on the other side of that bet for evens, for a pound, to say that there aren't two people that share a birthday? So remember, there's 365 days in the year, 40 people in the room. Does anyone fancy it? How about for £2? I'll put £2 on, you put £1 on. I'll give you odds of 2 to 1. Does anyone fancy it? No. That's fine. You can transfer it later. That's fine. Okay, very good. What's your name, sorry? Jasmine, great. So Jasmine's willing to take me on £1 for £2, okay, or £2 for £1. Okay, so let's do it. Let's figure it out. So what we're going to do is, bearing in mind, I hopefully don't know any of your birthdays. I don't know many people in the room. I certainly don't know anyone's birthday. So let's go through. We're going to go through month by month. I'm going to ask you to put your hand up if you have your birthday in the month that I call out. And then I'll just go through each person and get you to call out the number of your day, your birthday in that month. And then we'll see whether there are two people that share a birthday. So let's start with January. Yeah, anyone else in January? 2, yeah, so yeah. 12?
26.
Okay, February. Let's move on to February quickly. Yeah. 24th?
19.
19th. Close. Happy birthday for yesterday. March. Anyone? March. 1, 2, 3. Yes, sir. 18. 15. 23rd. Okay, disappointing. It's all right, we've still got 9 months to go. April. Anyone fancy April? Okay, yes. Over there. 5th. 8th. 28th. 15th. 23rd. Okay. May. Anyone fancy May? Great. Okay, yes. 21st? 24th. They sounded similar at least. What comes next? June. Who fancies June? No one. Oh, that's good though, because it means you'll be bunched up somewhere else. July. Who fancies July? Ah, there you all are. Very good. Thank you. Yes, lady at the back there. 20th. 4th. 31st. 19th. 13th. 29th. 3rd. How did that? Oh, sorry. Was it first? Oh, how did that not happen? Okay. August. Does anyone fancy August? Right. Okay. Oh, this is good as well. Yeah. 9th. 21st. 27th. 31st. 16th. 24th. 2nd. Ouch. Right. September. Anyone fancy September? No one in September. You're all in August. And what comes next? October. Yeah, that's all right. Okay. Yes. 20th. 7th. What's that? 14th. 25th. 21st. Okay. Still. Okay. November. Anyone fancy November? Okay. Yeah. 18th. 23rd. Okay. All right. December then. Come on. Yeah. All right. Okay. At least I thought it was just going to be one person putting their hand up. Good. Okay. Yes, sir. 22nd. 20th. 25th. 26th. Oh, I can't believe it. Okay. So it doesn't work out, and actually that's the only time that it's not worked out. My birthday is the 4th of April, and someone had the 5th, but no one had the 4th, unfortunately. I don't usually try to include myself, but if I get desperate, I should have just made it up. My birthday is the 26th of December as well. No, so yeah, okay. So, but why was I feeling confident to take this bet on, and even to offer odds of 2 to 1? So to put it another way, how many people do I need to have in the room before the likelihood of two people sharing a birthday becomes more than a half? Before it becomes more likely than not for two people to share a birthday, before it makes sense for me to take this 1-to-1 bet on? And the answer is surprisingly low, actually. It's just 23 people, which I think comes as a surprise. It certainly came as a surprise to me when I first saw this. And what I want to do is just try and work out the maths and with you to show why this really small number of people, when there are 365 days in the year, why you only need 23 people in the room to make it more likely than not that two people will share a birthday. Okay. So what we need to do is is not just to work out the number of people in the room, but what you really need to do is work out the number of pairs of people in the room. Because actually we're thinking about 2 people sharing a birthday, so what we need to think about is how many pairs of people there are in the room. So I want to work out a formula for the number of pairs of people in the room, and so I've got my sort of crap maths reservoir dogs here, Mr. Green and orange and purple and lilac and white, and I'm going to find out with just these 5 people in the room how many handshakes there are. So Mr. Green goes first and he shakes hands with Mr. Orange and Mr. Purple and Mr. Blue and Mr. White, so that's 4 handshakes. And then Mr. Orange goes next and he shakes hands with Purple and Blue and White, and that's 3 handshakes. And then Purple goes next and shakes hands with Blue and White, and that's 2. And then finally Blue stands up and shakes hands with White, and that's 1 handshake. So it's 4 plus 3 plus 2 plus 1. So there's this nice pattern, and when you add those up, clearly it's 10. And so I want to come up with a formula for working out how many pairs of people there are in the room when there's more than 5. 5 is easy to work out. We could have just added it up. Effectively, it's just going to be the sum of these consecutive integers, 4 plus 3 plus 2 plus 1. And so these are called the triangular numbers. And the reason they're called triangular numbers will become apparent in a second. But I want to ask you, does everyone know the song, The 12 Days of Christmas? Does anyone not know this song? So, so it basically goes, it's this British Christmas carol. On the first day of Christmas, you've got this really generous boyfriend or girlfriend. They give you presents. The first day, they give you a partridge in a pear tree. And then on the second day, they give you 2 calling birds, 2 turtle doves. 2 turtle doves. 3 French hens on the third day. And on the 4th day, they give you 4 calling birds and then 5 gold rings on the 5th day. But the thing is that they give you all of these things every day. So the first day you just get this one. On the second day you get these 2 and this one. On the third you get these 3 and these 2 and this one. Okay, so the question is, on the 5th day of Christmas, how many presents does my true love give to me? So the reason they're called triangular numbers is because you can arrange them in this nice, neat triangular array like this. And I want to come up with a more general formula for this rather than just the 5th day, but we'll work it through with the 5th day of Christmas. So what I'm going to do is rearrange this shape into a different shaped triangle, and I'm going to bring on a whole second set of gifts. Okay, so I've doubled the number of gifts, and now I've made this not a triangle, I've made this into a rectangle. And the reason I made it into a rectangle is because it's really easy to work out the number of presents in this rectangle. It's just n, where n is the number of days, so in this case 5, times by n plus 1, so in this case 6. Okay, so I can work out that when n is 5, the number of presents is 6 times 5, so the number of rows times by the number of columns. But I need to divide that by 2 because remember I introduced this whole second set of gifts which weren't in the original deal. Okay, so when I work out on the 5th day of Christmas how many presents there are, I need to do 6 times 5, which is 30, divide that by 2, and that gives me 15. Okay, and this will be a familiar number for people that play snooker because when you rack up in snooker, you have this nice triangle of 15 red balls that you have to try and pot. So the answer in this case is 30. So when I've got 23 pairs of people in the room, this is the magic number that I've said we need to have in order to make the probability of 2 people sharing a birthday more likely than not. How many pairs of people are there in the room? Well, for the first person, they get up and shake hands with 22 other people, and the next person shakes hands with 21, the next person with 20, and I animated the whole thing, and I don't know why, because I've actually got a formula for working this out now, but anyway, I got there, and so I wanted to show that you add up 22 down to 21, but that's just the same as doing this sum, 23 times 22 divided by 2, doing this product, and that actually works out as 253. So when you've got 23 people in the room, there are actually 253 pairs of people. And so this goes some way to explaining why it's more likely than not that you'll have 2 people sharing a birthday. But we're not done with the maths yet. So what I want to work out next is, when I've got 1 pair of people in the room, what's the probability that they don't share a birthday? Because I want to work out the probability they do share a birthday, but that's going to be complicated when I've got more pairs of people. So I'm going to start by working out the probability they don't share a birthday. So with 1 pair of people, it's actually really easy to do. The first person can have their birthday on any day of the year. I've put it here. That's actually my birthday, as I said before. And so the next person can have their birthday on any day. So they can have it on this day, or 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 this day. I think that's where I stopped. Apart from the day the first person had their birthday, and they can have it on any of the 364 of the 365 days of the year. So the probability that when you've just got 2 people in a room, 1 pair of people, that they don't share a birthday is 364 divided by 365. So it's pretty likely that they don't share a birthday. But as we increase the number of pairs, we'll see that that probability reduces. So what's the probability, what I'm going to call capital P, that when I've got 253 pairs of people in the room, that no one shares a birthday. So actually what I need to do is take that probability that one pair of people don't share a birthday and multiply it by itself 252 more times, because there are now 253 pairs of people in the room when I've got 23 people in the room. So when you work that out, you find out that it's actually just under a half. So the probability that two people don't share a birthday is just under a half, which means the probability that at least two people do share a birthday is 1 minus that. Those are the only two options. Either two people don't share a birthday or at least two people do share a birthday. So the probability that two people do share a birthday is 1 minus that, which is just above a half. So this is a plot of how, when the number of people changes, how the probability of a match changes. And I've sort of stopped it and highlighted it at this figure here, 23, to show you that when you get to 23 people, it climbs to just above a half. And by the time you get to 50, 60 people in the room, the probability is pretty near to certain. So actually with 40 people in the room, I was fairly confident that I was going to win that bet, hence me offering ridiculous odds. But this is probability, this is chance. It doesn't always work out in my favour. But I have to say I've made more money on that bet than I've lost. But there you go. Okay, so this is how it changes over time. So we did it and we saw that it didn't work out here, unfortunately, but can we see it in real life? Does it actually happen? So in the World Cup in 2014, there were 32 teams that went to Brazil to play in the World Cup, and each of these teams or these squads had a magic number of players. They had 23 players in there. So we would expect, on average, half of these squads to have 2 players that share a birthday. And so this is the Brazil squad from that year, and it turns out that in the Brazil squad, Hulk and Paulinho share a birthday on the 25th of July. And when you go through, if you choose to go through all the other 32 teams and look at all their players and find out all their birthdays, which one can do if one has the time to do that, then you find that actually exactly half of those squads, 16 of the 32 squads, had at least 2 players that shared a birthday. So it does sometimes work out really nicely and we get the exact average we're expecting, but of course it's probability. It doesn't always work out as nicely as that. So I said I was going to talk about crime in this part of the talk, and I haven't really done that yet, so I should make you aware that this next bit of the talk is a little bit more serious. So this is an image from St Anne's Square in my hometown of Manchester, a few days after the 22nd of May 2017. And on the 22nd of May 2017, no doubt you'll be aware that an Ariana Grande concert was happening at the Manchester Arena, and about 10:30 in the evening, some of the kids that had been going to the concert were leaving the arena, coming out into the foyer. Parents were in the foyer to meet their kids and take them home. And then Salman Abedi walked into the arena with a rucksack which was filled with screws and bolts and nails and a lot of explosives, and he blew himself up and he killed 22 innocent people that evening. And so I wasn't in Manchester at the time, I wasn't in the UK at the time, I was in Mexico for work. And I followed this story really closely as it was coming in sort of 6 hours. We were 6 hours behind everyone, so most people in the UK were asleep. And I was following this coming in the mid-afternoon. And I followed this story really closely, partly because it was in my hometown of Manchester, in an arena where I'd been to see gigs when I was a kid. And over the following days, this strange coincidence occurred or caught my eye. And it was that exactly 4 years earlier, on the 22nd of May 2013, Fusilier Lee Rigby was brutally murdered in another Islamist terrorist attack outside his barracks in Woolwich. And I thought this is strange. And I wasn't the only person to have noticed this coincidence. So actually, the Daily Star had this headline, "Dates Matter to Jihadis, Manchester Arena Attack on Lee Rigby Anniversary." And in that article, they were quoting a tweet from Sebastian Gorka, who was then President Trump's deputy assistant. And he said, "Manchester explosion happens on 4th anniversary of public murder of Fusilier Lee Rigby. Dates matter to jihadi terrorists." And I read this and I thought, is this true? Is it true that because these two events have occurred on the same day that we can infer that terrorists are organised and coordinated and can actually strike at will? Should we be more scared of terrorists than we actually are because they're this really organised group of people? And so I wanted to try and understand what the probability of these two events occurring on the same day of the year were purely by chance. Unfortunately, with the maths that we've just done of the birthday problem, we have a tool to do exactly that. So when you plot, so I looked at the number of terrorist incidents that occurred between April 2013 and April 2018 over a 5-year period, and I tried to find out how many Islamist terrorist attacks had occurred against Western nations, and it turns out that actually there were 39 terrorist attacks against Western nations over that period. And then if I show you that same graph that I plotted before, if you look at the number of incidents being 39, the probability that 2 of them fall on the same day of the year, purely by chance, if they're not coordinated at all, is nearly 90%. So in short, you'd be far more surprised if 2 terrorist incidents hadn't occurred on the same day of the year than when they actually did. So we can't draw causal inference from this coincidence. So I think it's important to understand that Sebastian Gorka's tweet was designed to scare people, to make people more worried of Islamist terror than they should be, to advance an anti-Islam agenda in the United States. But actually it had no basis in science or no basis in fact, because actually it's far more likely for 2 independent terrorist events to occur on the same day purely by chance. Okay, so we should expect that just by chance. Okay, so the final take-home messages from this part and from the talk as a whole. So coincidences can be surprisingly likely, and we need to be careful not to infer causality from 2 events happening at the same time or the same day. When you bump into someone you haven't seen for 10 years on the street, it's not for some magical, there's no cause for that. It's just coincidence, usually. Certainly don't be blinded by this illusion of certainty. So this goes for the whole talk. Just because a newspaper or a statistic is thrown at you, it doesn't mean that it's a newspaper statistic is a hard nugget of truth. Numbers aren't necessarily these nuggets of hard truth that we suppose them to be. We should learn to question the numbers and to question the people who would wield these numbers against us. So it might be an expert an expert witness in a trial who's an expert in medicine, but maybe not in the statistics that they purported to be an expert in, which convicted you. Or it might be the doctor who's interpreting your medical test results. So we should be careful to try to question this illusion of certainty. And then finally, as many of you are already aware, it's dangerous to make a bet with a mathematician. So beware of mathematicians bearing gifts. Thanks very much. You've been fantastic. Cheers.
What are your thoughts on the way that maths is taught to kids?
Yeah, I think it really depends on the teacher that you have. I think that makes a huge difference. I think if you get a great teacher who really works hard to put things in a real world context, then that can make a really big difference. I work a little bit with the group called Core Maths. This is a relatively new qualification somewhere between GCSE and A-levels, and it's all about teaching people practical maths that's actually going to be useful in everyday life. So I'm a big fan of this idea of maths for social justice, so educating people so that they aren't manipulated by statistics, and that they don't let people wield these numbers and manipulate them. So I think this core maths qualification is doing a lot to address that, but we can always be doing more in school to try and make maths more applicable and to answer the question, where am I ever going to use this, which is the question that kids come up with all the time. But there are uses and applications of maths all over the place. We just need to dig them out and to show people where they can really make an impact.
Did you send Liddell the maths?
I haven't sent Rod Liddell the maths that I did. I suspect he wouldn't even give me the time of day. I suspect he's not that interested in the real statistics, but maybe it's worth doing.
This may be recency bias on my part, but I have this feeling that numbers are becoming increasingly weaponized and willfully misused in some of the ways that you described. I'd just be interested in your personal take on that and how you feel about it, being a student of numbers and having watched them closely, or is it that they've always been used in this way and it's just amplified now? And then I guess the second part of that question is, you've talked about kind of the educational initiatives you're doing, which operate at the level of the individual and trying to empower them but in terms of government or any other institutions, any advice or policy that you would like to see implemented?
Right, two really, really great questions. I think numbers are increasingly being weaponized. I think you're right, it's difficult to tell, but I think with the advent of huge amounts of data and being able to process that data better, it's easy for politicians to call up a number which suits them, for example. So politics is a place where numbers are frequently used and abused. And actually there seems to be almost no comeuppance for politicians using dodgy statistics. So there are great programs like More or Less, which do look into the statistics behind the headlines, into the real numbers there. But yeah, it really relies on us as consumers of these statistics, people who watch the political debates, for example, to go and to read the fact check the next day when the BBC publishes their fact check, or whoever it is. Snopes is a great website for doing fact check. We need to actually go and read those websites and hold politicians to account and say, actually, you know, what you said is completely not true. I don't believe that, and therefore I'm going to vote with my feet and vote accordingly. So yeah, I think numbers are increasingly being weaponized, and that there's little comeuppance, but you know, we as consumers of those numbers need to start to hold politicians accountable. And the second part was about education, and so it's interesting. I'm a little bit mixed because I saw this call from Dominic Cummings recently to increase the number of weirdos in government, which I didn't think was a particularly good way to say it. But I think we should start to. I mean, there's something behind that, in that I think we do need to have more experts in the civil service, people who are really comfortable with crunching numbers, people who are comfortable with making science-based policy, evidence-based policy. I think it's really important that the policies that we put into action are actually based on real evidence, not just sound bites. They're not just highly politicized to try to capture the popular imagination. There should be underlying science behind them. So I think, in some senses, yeah, increasing the scientific literacy of people in the civil service and in government is no bad thing, but I'm not sure the way Dominic Cummings has gone about it is quite the right way. But yeah, thanks very much.